Think today's airlines have it all? You might be surprised by the rich history of now extinct airlines that once dominated the skies. Today, we remember these forgotten flyers. Take off in 3, 2, 1. You really would be doing a disservice to the flying industry by starting this list without mentioning Pan American World Airways. You know how there's a super hot cheerleader that everyone has their eyes on? Yeah, that was basically what Pan American Airways was for the United States throughout the 1900s. Not only did it literally tread new ground or at least fly over it, Pan Am was the first to do it worldwide. A lot of things that are now common in the flying industry, like reservation systems and jumbo jets, also came from this airline. Can you really deny its impact on the concept of a flight in America, when it is like the One Direction of airlines? Pan Am was America's only airline at one point that was an international air carrier. With so many accolades under its belt, it is no wonder why it is an American legend. Transworld Airlines was another really famous line that operated between 1930 and the start of the 2000s. Primarily, it would focus on routes from New York to Los Angeles, and those cities were melting pots of people from all over America to begin with, especially nearby cities like Kansas and St. Louis. Would you not prefer if your flight made the inevitable pit stop in your neighborhood? In America, after the Airmail Act of 1930 was passed, TWA became one of the top 4 airlines throughout the nation. Unfortunately, the Airline Deregulation Act would cause Transworld to go on a downward spiral. Losing your holding company can do a lot to you, and to make matters worse, there was Flight 800. This flight was the 3rd worst airplane accident in all of American history, and it permanently put a lid on the airline's future. Anyone from the mid-90s would agree that if we are going to bring up the Big Four of the United States flight world, then Eastern Airlines rightfully carved their place into that exclusive club. Stationed at Miami with Eddie Rickenbacker in charge of the company, a World War I veteran pilot, it had a chokehold on any kind of air travel that happened between Florida and New York. If you ever shifted during the 30s to 50s period between the two, chances are you definitely booked a flight with Eastern Airlines. Under Eddie's leadership, the company did exceedingly well and had a long-lasting market presence. But when leadership changed, so did the future of the airline. Frank Borman would constantly overload the organization with debt loads and disputes over labor. While this started the eventual decline of EA, it was not until American Airlines took over most of their routes that they faded from the market. The airline industry back then did not just consist of the Big Four, though, and smaller names like Continental Airlines were also very beloved domestic choices. Having hubs in many central locations such as LA, Washington, and Denver, Continental Airlines actually became known for its hospitality. Respectable and near first-class service on domestic flights, especially on Chicago-Los Angeles routes. Continental Airlines enjoyed their fair share of the spotlight up until 2010, when they merged with United Airlines. You might be wondering why such a successful airline would opt for a merger in the first place, and it is a great question. The answer is that the deregulations of the 1970s and airline policies had a massive impact on the industry, which eventually loosened Continental Airlines' established dominance. Eventually, by the start of the 2000s, it was a shadow of its former self. And at that point, the bigwigs thought it was best to benefit by merging with another company. Northwest Airlines also started off in the 1920s like all the other ones on our list so far. Since all of their backstories align around the same time period, you can imagine how competitive the market must have been, right? Northwest Airlines still fared pretty well despite the tough crowd and operated mostly from its HQ in Minnesota. Northwest also purchased the next airline we will talk about, but let's get to that later because it has something to do with Pan Am too. Northwest Airlines had its primary strength in its solidly built domestic routes and Pacific flights, and before it merged with Delta Airlines, it was the 6th biggest airline in the whole world. Both domestically and internationally, by the way, its domestic routes were some of the largest in all of America. Even in its last years before the merger, it was flying around 5 million people annually in the early 2000s. So, Republic Airlines is a bit of a jack-of-all-trades that made its mark in the industry by having strong collaborations with others. It is one thing to be a team player, but if you really wanted to turn some profit, you would have strong industry relations. Republic Airlines understood this and maintained those ties in many ways, like being contracted by popular names like the American, Delta, and United Airlines. This airline would continue growing by gobbling up its competitors and making convenient alliances with those it could not buy out. One codeshare agreement where, another takeover here, and a lot of merging of subsidiaries. This led to it having an impressive resume, such as having the world's biggest fleet of Embraer aircrafts, but it has relatively been quieter these past few years. US Airways gained its claim to fame in much the same vein as Republic Airlines. US Airways first began as an up-and-coming mail airline by the name of All American Aviation. Soon, it was a commercial airline for regular people to use. Then the name was changed in '53 to Allegheny Airlines for at least the next 26 years, and it had many mergers that helped it establish itself as one of the U.S.'s most capable legacy carriers, taking the name US Airways once again in 1997. Their particular forte was a massive international and domestic system with more than 190 destinations, so you had a lot of options for your summer vacation. Unfortunately, in the early 2000s and 2010s, it went through bankruptcy twice. Then it had the table pulled under from it when one of the companies it acquired did a reverse merger on it. Do you think they were right to expand so much, or did they fly too close to the sun? A lot of airlines got their start as being passenger and cargo services, and National Airlines was no different, except this one came much later than all the rest on the list. The airline was founded in the 1980s and had its hub in Orlando, which boosted the economy of the state and also provided a much-needed option for flights to citizens there. Murray Air and National Air Cargo merged together to make this airline, and as a result, they had vast access to lots of flying routes across the nation. It was similarly dependable for cargo businesses and operations throughout the globe. Unfortunately, the September 11th attacks of 2001 had a lot of negative impact on airline businesses and caused so many money headaches that a lot of them took real heavy blows. National Airlines could not sustain its success because it suffered from bankruptcy for almost 2 years in the 2000s before it finally shut down in 2002. While businesses like National Airlines bided their time and put in work consistently, others like Braniff International Airways got busy in a jungle-like market. Dominating the Midwestern and Southwestern routes throughout Central and South America, it was a major airline throughout the 30s to 60s and rose to prominence by acquiring many companies. They were based mostly in Dallas but had holdings and subsidiaries over the nation, and it is quite ironic that this is how they made their bread. If you are wondering why, then it is because Braniff actually met its end in the same way. After being negatively impacted by the strict airline deregulations that happened in the early 70s, Braniff could not handle the overexpansion it brought on itself and eventually was bought out. The parent company purchased all assets in the company for a pretty penny, but even they could not make it a sustainable moneymaker. Piedmont Airlines is a subsidiary that is one of the many ones the American Airlines Group collected over the 90s. American Airlines would often use Piedmont aircrafts and routes to anyone who was originally planning on using one of the routes. It had 2 primary hubs, one that was in Philadelphia and the other in Charlotte Douglas Airport, and it has an impressive number of staff. A whopping 10,000 at least serve the airlines overall and help it manage its 50-destination-long route system. Piedmont Airlines, as of recently, were one of the largest fleets and airways to exist in America. This airline was originally Allegheny Airlines, and it changed the name to Piedmont, perhaps as part of a rebranding effort. It must have been successful since Piedmont became a common name in the States. We have talked a lot about the south and western parts of America, but there were more routes than just those, and names like Northeast Airlines would fill the demand soon enough. This was originally Boston Maine Airways, and it had a big route all over the north and northeastern parts of America. Later on, it would add stops like Canada and the Bahamas. Northeast Airlines were typically a pretty tame presence as compared to some of the other carriers here, and that probably explains why it ended up being taken over by Delta Airlines in '72. This merger would mix the routes that Northeast Airlines already established and add flights to New England internationally. We are pretty sad to see this one go, because it seemed like a unique experience throughout the skies. Here's another one that broke away from the mold by having a sweet 60s beginning. Air California first appeared in Newport Beach as an intrastate airline, and it worked together with Pacific Southwest Airlines to form two of California's primary interstate airlines. The only difference between the two was that PSA was born in the unregulated and competitive scene of the early 1900s, whereas Air California came at a time when flight travel was more regulated. In fact, the company itself was aware of these differences and did their best to make sure PSA competition did not negatively harm AirCal. A bit after the deregulations, this airline did go through company drama nonetheless when they changed owners multiple times. Each leaving the organization made it more vulnerable and unstable. It was eventually decided to merge it into American Airlines given the uncertain market conditions. Even this did not last long, as American Airlines would largely scrap the network they got from AirCal. Pacific Southwest Airlines, or PSA, did not just have a hand in AirCal, but were one of the major players for California overall, being the state's unofficial flag carrier. You do a job like that for almost 40 years and do it that well, you deserve to be in a top 20 list. The success of PSA as an intrastate airline also inspired others like Southwest Airlines. When the deregulations occurred, PSA responded by expanding into routes it had not tapped into yet. Unfortunately, its performance was less than what the bigwigs wanted. In 1986, US Air bought PSA, and by 1991, it was fully a part of the company. It is funny how it can take so long to build as strong of a market presence as PSA, and it only takes a couple for it to vanish. Many of these airlines tried to do what People Express Airlines had done to mechanical science. That is, they all tried to create a customer base with middle-class households by offering affordable pricing. Unfortunately, none of them were quite like People Express, which is how it was stylized. It was widely regarded as the USA's most effective low-cost airline before it merged with Continental in '87. Actually, from its inception in 1981, the airline had a rather relentless attempt at expanding. Guess some people can be really hasty when they get into the rat race, huh? But despite its rapid expansion and pace, it moved smart by offering standard pricing for economy seats and lower prices during off-peak hours. Despite offering first-class seating by '86, it still always markets itself as an option for the American who wanted to fly without breaking the bank, and we have to wonder if it worked with the crowd. ValueJet Airlines was a company that tried to do the same thing People Express did but failed rather quickly. It started off in 1993, and by 1998 it was already merged into a larger company, AirTran. It seemingly had all the ingredients a recipe for success needed: a low-budget-oriented pricing strategy and operating bases in many states like Georgia, Atlanta, Boston, and Orlando. So what happened? Why the poor performance? ValueJet unfortunately got cost-effective by sacrificing quality. The planes it had were used crafts that other airlines had, and the workers were undertrained. No maintenance teams were there, and temporary contractors would be hired. Thus, the airline had a bad rep for safety issues, and trust was not exactly something it was good at building with the American people. It is always worth it to spend the extra pennies for a better impression. Hughes Airwest worked between 1970 to 1980, and one thing separated it from its competitors. See, it had this very distinctive fruit marketing that just made the planes really endearing in an odd way. All the planes were this strong shade of yellow, and its slogan was "Top Banana in the West." Only 10 years later, after it started in 1970, it would be bought by Republic Airlines, so we guess it was not Top Banana for too long. That also got merged into Northwest Airlines, which was eventually overtaken by Delta Airlines in 2010. This industry really thrives off of merging and takeovers, does it not? Still, for the brief time it did last, it was a reliable and cute experience, and even if it was just a simple coloring trick, people did want to ride in a yellow plane. Ozark Airlines had a much longer run in comparison to Hughes, but they also got overtaken by a name earlier on the list. This time around it was Trans World Airlines. Ozark got its big break in the industry when it won several routes and took control of the Parks Airlines company, giving it enough options and routes to finally have real worth in the market. This was an airline that also proved that marketing your planes is worth it, as it would feature swallows on the fins of its planes according to local legends of swallows returning every year to California in March. This one would sadly not have the same fairy tale-like return to the market as it vanished into the company it got taken by. We have not talked too much about the mid-Atlantic routes despite the list nearing its end soon, so let's take care of that and dip into some Mohawk Airlines history. Mainly based out of Pennsylvania, it operated from the mid-40s to the 70s before it got acquired by Allegheny, though at its height it was its own force to be reckoned with. Over 2,000 staff and several notable regional airline operations under its belt were an impressive track record, you know? It was also the first airline to hire African-American staff in a very politically charged time. It was also the first airline to use computer reservation instead of manual ones like everyone else, and the first one to ever use flight simulations. So not only was it largely controlling the mid-Atlantic routes, it was an industry pioneer. It only ever had to merge with Allegheny due to not being able to pay debts the owner took on to keep the company going initially. Capital Airlines was the top trunk carrier of the United States, and it served literally the entire country. East, South, Southeast, and Midwest, all except the northern regions, fell under Capital Airlines as established routes. Despite only having a 13-year-long run, the airline was pretty notorious for being the largest carrier domestically with one of the highest passenger counts. Really, the only ones that succeeded were the Big Four at the time, and nobody was competing with those guys besides themselves. Wanting to change that, though, Capital eventually merged with United Airlines in '61. Some financial struggle also influenced the decision, and in a bid to avoid bankruptcy, they sold to United. This resulted in the largest airline merger in known history, but the sheer size of the product that followed made it real hard to manage too, which contributed to why Capital fell off and vanished from memory. So, we clearly had a lot of great options that did not last because of an unforgiving market. Would you fly in some of these forgotten aircrafts? Let us know in the comments below.